Good evening to those bored enough to watch. In a previous video, I discussed Yakuza 3 and why I think that the game, despite its issues, is still one with a great number of qualitative attributes that will serve to present this game as a wonderful experience worth playing through. Yakuza 4, the next game, is one that seeks to improve upon it in a multitude of ways, while adding things of its own. This game introduces the ability to wander Kamurocho with 4 new protagonists, each featuring their own stories that interconnect to one another in some form, each with their own combat styles respectively. Yakuza 4 is a game that tries to do too much, each to varying degrees of success, as sometimes the game excels in presenting aspects of itself while other times not giving itself the chance to properly blossom as a result of backpedaling and retcons. In this video, I hope to discuss why I recommend Yakuza 4, talking about things that I both liked and disliked along the way, and I hope you can join me as I do so. So, with that said, let's discuss the Yakuza 4. The game opens during the date of March 1st, 2010 in Kamurocho. A man is laid on the couch reading an article in a building referred to as Sky Finance, soon putting the article away and turning over to take a nap, ignoring the ringing phone as he does so, though he eventually picks up when they begin to call his cell phone. This is Shun AKIYAMA, a famous moneylender known as the Lifeline of Kamurocho, and on the other line is his secretary, Hana, calling to chew out her boss and send him out to collect debts and run on errands. On the way, we get introduced to the combat, which I'll be sure to discuss in due course. But for now, we watch as Kiddo from TANIMURA Enterprises runs by, prompting AKIYAMA to see what's going on inside the office. When he gets inside, he mentions that some members of the Saiwa clan have been stirring up trouble in a club owned by the Tojo clan, which is a problem for TANIMURA Enterprises due to the fact that the Saiwa are on equal standing with the Tojo, yet are causing havoc on their properties. This would cause trouble to brew down the ladder, as Kanimura looks to Arai for accountability, who then looks to Kiddo for accountability. How do I know this? Well, AKIYAMA, who happened to be listening in on the conversation, explains it to the guy who didn't understand the problem. As for who this Arai person is, we won't see him until a bit later in the story, so keep that name in the back of your mind for a while. After alluding to some sort of agreement reached between himself and Kanimura, AKIYAMA leaves, in which subsequent to that, the man himself comes in and sits down, telling him to let Arai know that squashing this conflict is a task for him to handle. With that, we then cut to AKIYAMA enjoying a drink with some of the homeless before watching as this Arai individual talks to a Shibata about something correlating to Kamurocho Hills and gauging how much the building is worth. So, after that, AKIYAMA decides to go and see where the trouble's been brewing, and when he gets there, we get into a fight with this Ihara character, in which after doing so, Arai arrives, where he and AKIYAMA share a moment of bonding. Right from the moment the two begin their conversation, it's obvious that there is an essence of familiarity between these two characters, as AKIYAMA compliments Arai on his growing ability to rise to prominence in his line of work, even referring to Kiryu before alluding to some of his own background, and how all it took was a little windfall for him to become the person that he is. Their conversation is cut short when Ihara emerges with a gun, ready to shoot as Arai inches toward him ever so slowly, eventually managing to somewhat pull the gun down, though not enough as it grazes him when the trigger is eventually pulled. Ihara runs away, as Arai sends Kiddo after him, though it's to no avail as he eventually gets a call that cuts a brief discussion between himself and AKIYAMA even shorter. So, while Arai attends to his business, AKIYAMA gets a call from Hana telling him to go back to the office and deal with claims of fighting happening outside correlating to the Saiwa clan. Upon his arrival, he finds a dead Ihara, and Arai standing over his body, of him contemplating what AKIYAMA told him earlier about making it big and how it simply wasn't meant to be. He runs off, and as he does so, another individual arrives to inspect the body. He appears to be on the police force as he mentions that they'll be arriving soon, and that a man both himself and AKIYAMA appear to be familiar with, a man by the name of Sugiyuchi. This is a great opening for not only this game but AKIYAMA, as this game tasks itself with introducing 3 new playable characters on top of Kiryu, and due to that fact, the spotlight is split amongst the Yakuza 4. The game has to make an impact in properly introducing us to AKIYAMA's character and leaving an impression, in which it does so quite nicely. He's mostly a relaxed individual who prefers to keep a calm mind when dealing with the majority of the situations he finds himself wrapped up in, but all the same you can tell that he has a good heart. This opening also allows us to see Kamurocho from the perspective of someone other than Kiryu, by placing us in the shoes of a man who's not as reputable, but can still see the massive void that Kiryu left when he went to Okinawa, and through the perspective of AKIYAMA, the game establishes that such a gap in Kamurocho's operations have yet to be filled. This is a Kamurocho still under the influence of Kiryu, but still yet to find anyone to fill the shoes that he took off when he left. In general, I like this opening, as it introduces us to a new playable character, and also many points of interest that captivates the player's interest. We cut to a flashback flashback of a time where Akiyama was once homeless, resting out on the streets of Kamurocho before the sounds of an explosion ring out across the city. The top of the Millennium Tower is caught ablaze, and money is raining from the sky. Among the many other city dwellers, Akiyama scrounges the area for any money he can get his hands on. In the present day, Akiyama is awoken and allowed to leave his cell, in which on his way out, Sugiyuchi stops him and tries to make him stay away from money lending to TANIMURA and his men, in which Akiyama asserts that he has his reasons for doing so and doesn't plan on stopping anytime soon. He soon learns that TANIMURA is dead, in which Sugiyuchi then demands that Akiyama stays away from the business regarding the UNO Saiwa and the Kanimura. Back at Sky Finance, he decides to take a breather with a cigarette, but during a search for a lighter, he comes across an old picture of what seems to be his previous occupation. He quickly closes the drawer, seemingly in an act of frustration before hearing someone enter the office. When the woman takes off her glasses, Akiyama is reminded of an individual in the picture he saw in his drawer earlier, and so the two converse a little, including regarding details about the woman's previous work in a place called Drama Queen, which is where she got her lighter. Ultimately, she asks for 100 million yen, outlining all of the details such as the fact that she wants the sum of money in cash in 10 days. Akiyama explains that customers usually have to pass a test with the difficulty being correlated to the sum of money being asked for, and in this case, the test is going to be difficult. So, with Akiyama asking her to come back to the office the next day, the two depart, though not before she introduces herself as Lily. Later, Akiyama meets with Kiddo, who recalls the moments that he found Kanimura dead in his office, in which, according to the police, the only clue as to who could have done it is the supposed gender of the killer being female. During their conversation, they're interrupted by the Shibata family, in which Kiddo is told to run while Akiyama fights them off. After doing so, one of the men tell him that more members of the Shibata family are arriving at Sky Finance's office, in which Akiyama seems to be calm that such a thing is happening. Though, that calmness quickly turns to panic as Sugiyuchi arrives with the police to take him in, and so he runs away from them. This is where the chasing section of the game returns, in which I will discuss this later, so for now, when he reaches his office, Akiyama witnesses men flying out of the building, but Hana was able to make quick work of them. He lays to rest on the couch while Kiddo stares in confusion at what just happened, and so while he does that, I want to take this moment to talk about the combat in this game, more specifically, Akiyama's combat. As the game is split between 4 different protagonists, each have their own attributes which include their own style of combat, in which Akiyama's involves around building combos with his fast legwork and swift kicks. I really liked playing as him. I think that the combat fixes a lot of things from the previous games, such as giving the player more opportunities to find weak points in the enemy's attacks. And specifically with Akiyama, I really enjoyed the combo-based combat, though I do think that it can be unfairly easy to be overwhelmed by an extreme influx of enemies swarming you at once, and with these characters' fighting styles only ever being centered around one-on-one fights, fighting large crowds of enemies can be difficult at times. It seems as though some things regarding Yakuza 3 were fixed, though not everything was in my opinion. The combat still fails to address the concept of crowd control and fine-tuning the combat further to accommodate fighting them. Another issue I've had with the combat is the lock-on, and how at several points during my playthrough, I would just lock onto nothing when I was trying to readjust where I was facing to better aim my attacks. Though, that isn't to say that the combat wasn't fine-tuned at all, as some of the issues I had with Yakuza 3's combat was fixed, especially during one-on-one fights, as it is more manageable and balanced in finding weak points in the enemy's attack patterns and exploiting them to maximize damage dealt, which in my opinion allows you to see the true vision behind Yakuza 3's combat, as its execution is heavily improved upon in this game. Now that I'm done talking about how the combat universally across this game has changed between this one and the previous, I do want to say specifically with Akiyama, his combat was extremely fun to play around with, in which I do think that in general, it is an extremely good way to introduce the combat to the player. It's different to what we're used to with Kiryu, but it is easy to adjust to, which in turn allows for one to have fun with it during their playthrough. After wandering around for a while, Akiyama returns to Sky Finance to find the police guarding the area, in which when he enters his office, he finds Sugiyuchi sitting inside, who explains that Sky Finance is going to be under the constant watch of the police, as Isao Katsuragi, the captain of the UNO Cyber clan, has escalated the shooting that involved the Rai. We cut to the Tojo clan headquarters and watch as Daigo Dojima tries to make peace with the UNO Cyber, though the money offered doesn't seem to sway Katsuragi. Eventually, Kazuo Shibata enters the meeting, offering his pinky finger that he seemingly cut off for the purpose of making amends for what happened. Though, Katsuragi approaches Daigo, explaining that Ihara was a lieutenant and valuable to the future of the UNO Cyber clan, and his death puts their future in direct jeopardy. He demands that Arai be found and killed as compensation, or if they can't do that, then they would gladly take the ownership of Kamurocho Hills from Majima and his family as an alternative. Giving Daigo some time to think over his decision before finalizing upon one, he leaves. And so we cut back to Akiyama and Sugiyuchi sitting in the office of Sky Finance. The Tojo clan are scrambling to find Arai as soon as they can before the police or the UNO Cyber clan do, as the former keeps watch on all of the people he's likely to make contact with in hopes that they can find a lead on where he is. With that though, Sugiyuchi prepares to leave as Lily enters the room, and so we cut to Akiyama and herself talking about the test that she needs to pass, the first of which is going out and buying accessories such as dresses and necklaces before meeting at Club Elnerd. It's here that Lily learns that her test will be agree to make 3 million yen in sales at the club as a hostess in 3 days, in which if she does so, then Akiyama will lend her the money. Agreeing to meet later, the two find themselves at the theatre square where Akiyama tells Lily that for her first day, she managed to make 500,000 yen in sales. After giving her a bit of advice, the two roam the city for a while before finding themselves atop the roof of a building in the Champion District. Lily recalls how she used to live here and how happy her life was during that time, not really caring about finances and ultimately reflecting upon the irony that comes with needing it now more than ever in the present day. Eventually the two embrace, though their moment of bonding is interrupted by more members of the Shibata family. They're quickly taken care of, in which Akiyama and Lily make their escape from that area, deciding to call an end to their night as it'd risk more Shibata family members arriving. During a conversation with Kiddo, Akiyama tells him that he'll need to find Arai for answers on his own, and providing the funds for doing so is the only way he can help now. Kiddo refuses to take the money until Akiyama explains why he's so invested in Arai, in which he begins to explain more of his background. Once working for a bank before he was set up and fired on the charges of stealing money from the bank. Firm in his belief of his innocence, he chased every lead he could to prove it, though soon enough he found himself homeless on the streets of Kamurocho. One day there was an incident where the Millennium Tower was set ablaze and billions flew through the city. Akiyama was one of the hundreds of people scrambling through the streets to pick up as much as possible, garnering him 1 million yen. When attacked by thugs in his sleep for the money, Arai had saved him and promised to turn the city around. And it's here that Akiyama decided that if he were able to make something of his money, then he'd invest in Arai. Akiyama then begins to talk about the nature of Kamurocho and how it attracts all kinds of people, how everyone who comes to the city has a dream they want to accomplish, and though they never achieve it, they continue to pursue it. Akiyama believes that Arai is that individual who can show them that it is possible to achieve, as he has the strength and power to do so, reflecting upon how Kiryu's absence left a void yet to be filled, and how he believes that Arai is the one who can fill them. Though, he quickly changes the subject and tasks Kiddo with finding him. With that, while he's supposed to be running errands on behalf of Sky Finance, Akiyama instead goes to the club Lily was assigned to work in and spends his time giving her some aid in maximizing her profit. Thus, we enter a minigame where we roam the club and then adjust Lily's outfit to better suit what the customers want out of their hostesses. This is a section of the game that I don't really like, as it really does feel like it was here for the sole purpose of wasting time and not much else. Whether you choose to actively engage with this minigame or not, the story still continues all the same. And due to that lack of incentive to really be interested in what it has to offer, I can't help but feel as though this minigame was here to waste time and not much else. After Akiyama was done attending to his business in the club, he goes to the Champion District to run those overdue errands for Hana. Though, during his ventures, he finds the bar that Lily said she used to work for and deduces that she may have been lying about her previous occupation. Venturing inside, he finds a dead body that appears to have been there for days. Looking around, Akiyama finds that the individual was seemingly with the Shibata family from the looks of the crest on his jacket, as well as a collection of the same lighter Lily had when she walked into Sky Finance. Back at Sky Finance, the office is in complete ruins, as Hana recalls the moments where she entered to find Kiddo already in there awaiting Akiyama's arrival, in which the two were interrupted by the Hatsu Shibata family, of whom attacked Hana, took the office's client registry and Kiddo to an unknown place. According to what Hana heard, they're close with the Shibata family, and so after an interaction with our good man Mac, Akiyama decides to go and find them in hopes of getting both Kiddo and his registry back. Eventually finding them in the theatre underground, a long fight is initiated as Akiyama fights his way to where they're keeping Kiddo and the registry. Finding Midorikawa and Hatsu Shibata in a room with Kiddo and the registry, Akiyama demands that both be returned, though it appears as though the only way that will happen is through a fight, and so they do exactly that. After doing so, Hatsu Shibata explains that he was doing Shibata a favor in finding Lily, and thus stole the registry in knowing that she had gone to Sky Finance for a loan. Cutting to the final day of Lily's test, Akiyama waits for the total sales she garnered at his office, eventually getting a call from the club's manager and learning that she managed to get over the designated amount that she was assigned. So, at the Millennium Tower where the two agree to meet, they have a general conversation before Akiyama confronts Lily about why she killed both the boss of Tanimura Enterprises and the manager of Drama Queen, deducing that they were both from the Shibata family and wondering what her quarrels with them is. She doesn't answer, instead assuring him that she will pay the loan off one day before the two part ways. Back at the office, Akiyama chases Hana around town, in which after doing so she confronts him about having loaned so much money to Lily at once, knowing the increased likelihood that they may never see that money repaid. She mentions Akiyama's ex-girlfriend, in which she snaps and demands that she be left out of the confrontation. Regardless, Hana quits her job as the secretary of Sky Finance, and soon after, Akiyama finds himself at his club once again, dealing with Yakuza who, according to the manager, entered looking for Lily. Finding a man passionately singing and his men watching in sheer disappointment, he eventually notices Akiyama watching and introduces himself as Minami. After Akiyama shows Minami's men some mercy by turning off the karaoke, he learns that they're here in search of Lily, as they were ordered to bring her to Majima himself. Though, since he won't tell them where she went, Minami decides to stay until he does, and so he decides to kick them out by force, thus initiating a fight. After taking them down, Majima enters the club, in which Akiyama informs him that the Shibata family are also looking for her, in which he mentions that he needs to protect Yasuko, Lily's real domain, on the grounds of making amends for something that happened in 1985. On that note, we conclude AKIYAMA's part, in which I thought that his section of the game gives a really good introduction to not only the game itself but also his character, and developing it just enough for us as the player to be invested. AKIYAMA is initially introduced as an overly relaxed individual which can land him in trouble with those he surrounds himself with at times, but he shows that there is a greater intellect within his character only when he has to, in which the game manages to represent all aspects such as his relaxed nature, his intellect, and some of his inner baggage of his character in just 4 chapters, which honestly I really enjoyed. We begin on April 20th of 1985. Tiger SAEJIMA looks out his window before Goro Majima arrives. They engage in general conversation about miscellaneous things such as the environment and whatnot. SAEJIMA sends Yasuko out on an errand before himself and Majima speak about what they're about to do on the subsequent day, in which they're going to assassinate Yoshihara Ueno and his men with guns that Majima bought from the Dojima family to show him. The two then discuss their loyalty to this mission, vowing that they're ready to die for their respective bosses before we cut to the next day. SAEJIMA is awaiting Majima, who appears to be late to where they're supposed to meet up. He gets out of the car to find out where he is, but when he sees the Ueno cyber clan arriving, he hangs up the phone, and as the Ueno enter the ramen joint, SAEJIMA walks up to the trunk of his car, loads his person with all of the guns and walks straight in, shooting everyone in sight. Despite being shot himself a few times, everyone in there is presumed to have died through SAEJIMA single-handedly taking them all down, and so we cut to March 3rd of 2010. 25 years have passed since the incident and SAEJIMA has been on death row ever since. He's being transferred from a prison in Tokyo to Okinawa, and when the doors open and he's let out and shown his cell, we cut to the prisoners having dinner, with SAEJIMA among them. It appears as though Hamazaki is here too, but with that aside, SAEJIMA is instantly recognized, which garners the attention of everyone in the room, in which it appears as though some members of the Ueno Saiwa are here as well, and they want revenge for the killing of their boss. So, with that, a fight ensues in the dinner room. We're introduced to the combat here, but we'll discuss that later. After the brawl, Hamazaki is seen observing the fight while SAEJIMA addresses one of the individuals he just fought, telling him that their boss isn't the reason that their life is spent behind bars, and if they want someone to blame for that, then a mirror is what they need to look into. We then cut to the guards beating SAEJIMA before another enters and addresses one of them by the name of Saito, telling him to end his antics for the day. When all of the guards leave the room, Hamazaki enters and bribes the guard with money, and tells SAEJIMA that the Ueno Saiwa is still alive, being really close with the Tojo to the extent of even having land to call their own in Tokyo. After the events of 1985, the boss of the Sasai family ended up taking the blame and stepping down from the family and disappeared, and without their boss, his family ended up crumbling, and in the midst of that, the Shibata family rose to prominence. Additionally, Hamazaki mentions that there was something more sinister about Majima not arriving on the day of the assassination in 1985, and so, during their free time on the next day, Hamazaki and SAEJIMA plan their escape by discussing what they'll do and when they'll do it, in which, after they're done making preparations, we cut to later that night as the two execute their plan. Hamazaki, disguised as a guard, leaves his cell, prompting SAEJIMA to do the same, picking up his bed and throwing it off the balcony of the floor his cell was on. This causes the guard to come, and as Hamazaki leaves, SAEJIMA engages in a fight with the prison guards, thus initiating a long fight as he then needs to meet Hamazaki further into the facility, in which when he does so, he appears to have taken something from the office he was in. But with that, eventually the two make it to the yard. SAEJIMA tells Hamazaki to go first, as escaping was his idea, as SAEJIMA expresses his gratefulness to him for not stabbing him in the back regardless of what he's done in the past. Though, when it's time for SAEJIMA to begin climbing, the lights turn on, Saito and his men have caught up to the two convicts. SAEJIMA tells Hamazaki to begin escaping without him, as he's going to stay and fight through the guards in hopes of garnering more time for him to do so. With Hamazaki seemingly gone, they fight. After the brawl is over, SAEJIMA begins climbing. Though too tired to make it to the top, he begins to fall but is caught by Hamazaki. He's still here, and when asked why, he mentions that it wouldn't have felt right to leave behind the second person to ever trust him. SAEJIMA mentions that they're brothers now, as they're both partners in crime, and so as he begins climbing down, Hamazaki proposes the idea of teaming up together before he's shot by Saito. Telling SAEJIMA to find a man named Kiryu, he grabs him and jumps off the building, as SAEJIMA does so after him. Much like AKIYAMA, this chapter does a good job in establishing SAEJIMA's character. For example, this chapter throws you into a long fight almost immediately, which shows you his strength as an individual, fighting through the guards. Not to mention, it's quite a difficult long fight as you have no items except for mugworts to enter with, only garnering any items from defeating the guards themselves. Additionally, this first chapter seeks to present SAEJIMA's honor and how he ensures that he maintains that at all times, allowing Hamazaki to begin climbing the wall first, as it was his idea to escape, and if they don't do so together, then the entirety of their plan to do so means nothing to him, showing his honor and maintaining so whenever possible. The next day, the sun rises to another glorious morning at the Morning Glory Orphanage, in which Haruka is taking their unusually unhinged dog out on a walk. Mami runs to the shore, and as Haruka follows, she finds a washed up SAEJIMA lying on the beach. We cut to later that evening where SAEJIMA and Kiryu are sitting in the orphanage discussing the former's background. He narrowly manages to lie to Kiryu before we then cut to the two on the beach. Kiryu mentions that he knows that Saejima has been in prison and that his fabricated story about being a survivor of a shipwreck is false, and asks to know why he needs to go back to Kamurocho. Saejima alludes to wanting to know the truth as well as revenge, in which Kiryu refuses to aid him with the latter, with Saejima refusing to elaborate on his goals and Kiryu firm in his resolve. The two fight. Haruka sees them in the midst of their fight and tries to stop them, in which after she gets knocked down in the crossfire, Saejima begins to fall as he's weak from having been washed up on the beach, in which he mentions Hamazaki, alerting Kiryu and especially Haruka. While Saejima is resting, Kiryu tries to calm Haruka's paranoia about him knowing Hamazaki, as both of them haven't forgot about what happened at the end of Yakuza 3. Kiryu mentions that he'd happily help Hamazaki if he needed it, just as long as he learned to have faith in others, whereas Haruka is indecisive on what to think. With that though, Kiryu mentions that he has some shopping to do, and before he leaves, instructs Haruka to give Saejima a bag he found on the beach, as it might be his. And so when Saejima awakes, she does exactly that. Within, there's money for Saejima to get to Kamurocho, in which after collecting himself, he prepares to leave, telling Haruka his true name before walking away from the orphanage. As he does so, Kiryu walks in, acting unsurprised at what just happened, as the two sit and stare into the night, and the screen fades to black. This chapter, though short, was genuinely amazing to play through. Getting to fight Kiryu was something that seems so simple, but the build up to the prospect of such a thing is amazing. Considering how we've played through the previous games, we've seen what he's capable of, and that makes it all the more adrenaline pumping. I suppose that's what a tiger drop feels like. Though jokes aside, I really like how the game presents these two as equals, as in the cutscene after the fight, the two are seen at stalemate, unable to gain the upper hand on one another, even with Saejima being weak from all the damage he's taken to get there. This isn't the only instance we'll see the two fight in the series. As to my knowledge, there is one in Yakuza 5, but I'll save that for another day. In Kamurocho, Saejima immediately begins trying to find Sasai, the boss of the family he was formerly in before they crumbled, which leads to him finding Kiddo laying waste to the Shibata family, whom are still looking for a ride. When trying to interrogate him for information regarding Sasai's whereabouts, Kiddo ends up running away, prompting Saejima to chase after him around Kamurocho. After catching him, Saejima informs Kiddo of everything that happened, ranging from trying to decipher if Majima had really set him up on the day of the assassination, and whether his boss had really vanished, as well as finding out that he has a reputation among the Yakuza. With that aside though, Kiddo knows of an informer that will have the information needed, and after finding a place for Saejima to stay away from the cops, he begins his search. After walking in on this poor lad trying to take a midnight shite, he eventually finds the Forest of Sai, who tells Saejima that he'd reveal information with Sasai as long as he competes in a death match being held at the Colosseum, and so after winning, he stands in the middle of the arena. The people in the audience chant for him to kill, asking what difference taking another life would make to his body count, throwing a sword and continually pestering him to just finish his opponent off. He throws it to the ground and screams for everyone to be quiet, giving one of the most touching speeches of the entire game as he expresses his remorse for what he did all of those years ago. And though he was ready to fulfill his duty, he wasn't ready to live in the horror of what he had done for the rest of his life. I'll come back to this later, so do keep it in the back of your mind for now. I do think that this chapter solidifies Saejima's character more in the game, presenting him as a remorseful killer. As though he can never take back what he did that day, he carries the baggage of guilt for the rest of his life. It presents a new side of his character by showing him in a more vulnerable state, clearly triggered by the insensitive nature of the audience as they haven't experienced murder to the extent that he has. Throughout the game, though we do see sentimental aspects of Saejima's character, none of them ever reach the extent that this cutscene does, presenting his honor and remorse in one scene, as he quits the tournament and walks out. Luckily for him though, the forest reveals that it was just a test to see how he'd act under the circumstances where he was instructed to kill someone, and it appears as though he passed. Sasai had been brought to purgatory several months after he had gone missing, though he was barely clinging to life. He isn't the man that Saejima remembers, and he sees that for himself. Sasai is in a trance, without a shred of consciousness left, just barely being able to utter Saejima's name after several attempts to try and get through to him. After having some time to take it all in, Saejima decides to go and look for Majima, as he needs to know whether he was truly set up during the day of the assassination. So, in hopes of waiting for the onslaught of police to calm down, he goes back to his hideout, though when he gets there, he finds the homeless residents exhausted and defeated, and on a table sits Minami, who brings a message from Majima. He wants to meet Saejima at the Millennium Tower the next day, so after a brief discussion with Kiddo, we now enter the penultimate section of Saejima's section of the game, where you as the player are given the time to wander a police-filled Kamurocho to finish anything off before moving on to the next part of the game. I should mention that it isn't much of a problem if you choose to proceed with the finale, as you are given another opportunity at the end of the game to definitively play as all four protagonists before the end, though I can only guess that the game gives this opportunity now, as you'll have to wait for a while if you want to wander as Saejima again. I personally used this time to go through the Colosseum, room, in which after you're done wondering, SAEJIMA speaks to Kiddo once more, who asks whether he regrets what he had done that day. Once again, SAEJIMA mentions that he regrets taking those lives, but spending 25 years in prison and fulfilling his duty to his boss are two things that he doesn't regret. He then speaks about honor and duty, and how had he refused to do what he did that day, it would have gone against everything he believed in. He then addresses Kiddo more personally, to give things his best because he only has one opportunity. With that, he leaves to go and meet Majima. At the Millennium Tower, he finds Minami and the Majima family, who's rather interested to see what kind of man Majima would refer to as a sworn brother, and so after fighting through waves of the Majima family men, we eventually fight Minami himself. After doing so, Majima emerges from an elevator and takes SAEJIMA on a detour to the batting center. During his batting session, SAEJIMA rudely disrupts and demands to know why Majima never arrived on that day, in which Majima recalls the oath they swore the day they became brothers. Betrayal means death, and for whatever reason, Majima had done exactly that. So, if SAEJIMA wants answers, he'll have to beat them out of him, and thus they fight. This is an adrenaline-pumping fight, with the stakes being built, as Majima is someone we've been looking for alongside Sasai throughout the entirety of SAEJIMA's part of the game, in which being able to finally see and fight him was a great experience. My favourite part about this fight was where he turns into a fucking Beyblade and starts spinning all over the place. These two do have another battle in Yakuza 5, but once again, we'll get there eventually. After their fight, Majima mentions that the entirety of what transpired that day was a setup by Shibata. We then cut to Majima's perspective of 1985, as he was pulled by Shibata as he suspects that there is a traitor working with another traitor in the UNO Cyber clan to get them to declare war on the Tojo clan, allowing Sasai to earn a high-ranking position in the clan. This causes Shibata to forbid Majima from joining SAEJIMA, who is already about to perform the hit, in which he tries to leave regardless. Shibata calls his men, and thus we cut to a lone Shibata man attacking an apprehended Majima. It appears as though he managed to take them all down, but one, and thus is taking full advantage of him not being able to fight back. Majima still refuses to back down, spitting in the thug's face, as his refusal to meet his demands eventually leads to his eye being gouged out. Playing as SAEJIMA was a wonderful experience, being introduced to his remorse, honor, and strength as we see multiple facades of his character during these 4 chapters, as well as some of Majima's as well. The scene where SAEJIMA talks to Kiddo about honor and duty fully solidifies and asserts the nature of his character alongside the speech at the Colosseum, and I really appreciate that the game manages to explore so many aspects of his character during these 4 chapters, among the many other adrenaline-pumping moments such as fighting Kiryu. His combat was also really great to play through, as it fully alludes to his strength while giving the player another fighting style to enjoy. With that though, we end SAEJIMA's part of the game. March 8th, 2010. We watch as Sugiyuchi is interrogating a rather careless Masayoshi Tanimura about having touched the dead body of Ihara earlier in the game, though he's more interested in listening to horse racing. He prepares to leave, though not before he notices something rather peculiar about Sugiyuchi's shoes, though ultimately walking out. On his way to patrol, which is mostly just bullying illegal businesses for hush money, he's stopped by Sasai, who warns Tanimura not to go and play mahjong during his duty, which is what appears to have happened the previous day. When he's back in Kamurocho, he decides to find the person who anonymously gave the tip of his whereabouts during the previous day's duty, in which when he does, we're introduced to the combat. I'll come back to this, so for now, after that's settled, Tanimura takes the money of an illegal business owner and gives them a picture of Yasuko, telling them to call Tanimura if he ever saw her, after of which he finds himself in Homeland, the restaurant of Zhao, a man he considers a friend, giving the money to him before explaining the significance of what the shooting involving Arai meant, as it involves the UNO Cyber clan, the same clan that Tanimura's father was investigating before being murdered. He then talks about his desire to follow the case in hopes of finding the truth about what happened, though he's also following the lead of Yasuko SAEJIMA, as apparently his father was supposed to meet her during the day of his murder. Just then, Tanimura gets a call from the manager of the business he had taken money from earlier, as Yasuko has apparently been spotted. When he gets there, she initially denies being the woman he's looking for, though it's all but confirmed when Shibata's men try to abduct her. During the midst of the fight Tanimura has with them, Yasuko is kidnapped and taken to the docks, which is where he goes the moment he finds out. When he gets there, we enter a long fight with Shibata's men before listening in on Shibata and Rai discussing their further plans going forward from their current antics. Their conversation soon shifts to Yasuko, who's tied up in the same room. Ultimately, Arai eventually shoots Shibata and reveals that himself, Katsuragi, and a few other collaborators are working alongside one another, as well as the fact that Shibata had worked with Katsuragi in the Uenosawa assassination 25 years prior in hopes of securing a higher position in the Tojo clan before killing Shibata for good before Tanimura enters. After taking cover from Arai's bullets and re-entering the room, he finds that he's escaped, and it appears as though Shibata already died from the gunshots before he could ask any further questions. I think that this is a great opening to Tanimura
Tanimura's character, much like AKIYAMA and SAEJIMA, as the game once again presents multiple aspects of his character. On one hand, Tanimura can be considered corrupt by using the illegal businesses to his monetary advantage, though we can see that such a thing doesn't come from a place of greed, or more rather a desire to help those around him. It isn't exactly the most ethical way of approaching such an ordeal, but I do believe that the game is trying to show an aspect of his character, that he's misguided in the sense that he's a good person with a desire to aid those around him, but simply uses the wrong methods and approaches to fulfilling that desire. Additionally, the game also presents more depth to his character as we see that he's also chasing after the truth about his father, immediately gripping the player's attention as we join Tanimura in uncovering the true nature of what had really happened during that day. At Homeland, Yasuko mentions that she was indeed supposed to meet Tanimura's father in 1985, though he never showed, simply mentioning through a phone call that a greater force is at play, and SAEJIMA, despite having been the one who pulled the trigger, isn't the one who truly killed those 18 men, simply telling Yasuko to take care of herself as he'll have proof of his claims soon. As for Yasuko, Katsuragi had promised to help her prove Tiger SAEJIMA's innocence, as he was one of the victims of the shooting for the price of 100 million yen, or for murder. Seeing how at the time such a sum seemed impossible, she chose murder before going to AKIYAMA. She only realizes now that the entire time, Katsuragi was simply using her to silence those who knew the truth of what happened during that day. Eventually, she gives him a key to a car in the Kamurocho Central parking lot, and within is a car where Tanimura will find the 100 million yen in hopes of having a better chance of bargaining information from Katsuragi. As for Yasuko, she'll be leaving for Okinawa, as that's where she was told her brother is, and seeing as how his execution is in 2 days, she wants to be as close to him as she can. After retrieving the money and calling Katsuragi, the two agree to meet the next day in front of the Millennium Tower. So, the next day, the two take a stroll around Kamurocho as Katsuragi explains how himself and Shibata were the ones who authored the script of SAEJIMA's antics in 1985, where Katsuragi would act as one of the victims of the shooting, while Shibata would hold Majima back from attending alongside SAEJIMA. Eventually, the question shifts to Tanimura's father and why he had to die that year, in which Katsuragi explains that not only had he discovered that the hit was staged, but he had also discovered corruption in the police force, as they had concealed the real killer and made SAEJIMA take the blame for the incident. When asked who killed his father and who had finished the assassination, Katsuragi mentions that he wants Tanimura to tell him where Yasuko is. After some hesitation, he gives the 100 million yen in hopes that it'll substitute for Yasuko's location, as he mentions that she already left for Okinawa. Katsuragi merely laughs as Tanimura notices the strangely absent Kamurocho as Katsuragi's men arrive, and before the man himself leaves, he gives one more vital piece of information, that the man who truly killed the UN Osaiwa's men in 1985 was himself. He also mentions that Homeland is going to be receiving a visit from someone he arranged to take care of them, and so when Sugiyuji arrives with the police force, Tanimura hastily makes his way to Little Asia. This enters into a long fight, where Tanimura uses a combination of the briefcase and his arsenal during the given sections of the fight, in which it's here that I want to give a more general review of Tanimura's combat in the game, in which I think that it's really good. I think that the game does a good job in finding a way to differentiate it from the other styles, with the addition of things such as the parry, which allows for you to dodge an enemy's attack if you were to use it before they do so. I do think that there is an issue with crowd control in Tanimura's style, as there isn't a way for you to be able to do so, meaning oftentimes I just end up cheesing some of these fights with the sheer power of grabbing and throwing enemies, as you gain momentary invincibility during those respective animations. Overall, I think that Tanimura was extremely fun to play as. Exploring the depth of his combat was truly interesting and unique, which leads to a greater point of this game being able to successfully differentiate all of the characters and their combat styles from one another, which is something that I really enjoyed and liked about the game. During this long fight specifically, the game makes use of the briefcase by granting you the ability to bonk enemies on the head with it, in which I believe does a good job in differentiating the gameplay of this section specifically, as with the briefcase you don't have access to your general moveset and are restricted to the one with the briefcase, meaning you need to figure out a different way to approach the fight as a whole. Another thing I want to talk about is the chasing minigames from Yakuza 3, which make a prominent return in this game. This section here being no different to that. It is heavily modified to simplify the minigame, as being able to sprint is no longer a feature as you run at a designated speed from an enemy or after one depending on the scenario. While I do believe that it is much easier than the previous game, I can't help but prefer Yakuza 3's iteration of this minigame. As much as I initially disliked them, it's undeniable that they were more engaging and interesting than the ones here, as it required mastery of learning the area enough to be able to competently chase after people in that game. And there was also a sense of speed and adrenaline which I enjoyed during those sections. Here, the speed decrease takes away from that, and while I appreciate the decreased difficulty, I will say that I preferred the way they were in Yakuza 3 as opposed to 4, though that isn't to say that they were bad in this game. They're definitely improved in a lot of ways, such as the controls feeling more precise than Yakuza 3 and many others. Conclusively, I would have to say that my opinion on Yakuza 4's iteration of these minigames is more of a mixed bag than anything, as it presents a lot of advantages and disadvantages that stopped me from having a conclusive opinion on it. With that aside, after making his way into Homeland, he sees that everything is seemingly okay, and that Hisai has been there waiting for Tanimura's arrival. In Homeland, Tanimura, Hisai, and Zhao all speculate into the cover-up by the police regarding the UNL Saiwa hit, in which eventually Eventually, Tanimura and Sasai find themselves in Archive Room 13 for answers. Within a case file of the incident, he finds that not only had his father worked on investigating the case, but Sugiyuchi had worked alongside him. Sasai seems quiet when Tanimura mentions that he found this out, in which the two leave. At Homeland, Tanimura begins to speculate into the possibility that someone on the police force had killed his father, though for now, he leaves his speculation to rest while he does so himself. The next day, Tanimura decides to go and return the 100 million yen to AKIYAMA, and so at Sky Finance, after replicating the closest thing we'll ever see to that Spider-Man meme in a Yakuza game, he finds himself discussing everything that's happened since Yasuko and AKIYAMA departed at the Millennium Tower. Ultimately, AKIYAMA denies Tanimura's return of the money, in which their discussion is interrupted by Kiddo, who calls AKIYAMA. Mishima, one of the two men causing havoc at the bar AKIYAMA beat Ihara in earlier in the game, is asking for police protection in exchange for the information on all he knows. Eventually, the two reach the conclusion that Katsuragi could be merely following orders in ensuring that everyone who knew the truth of what happened that day is dead, from someone who can't afford to let the truth unleash into the public, as there is simply no reason he would wait 25 years to begin making his move considering how he could have killed them all decades prior. There's also a possibility that there is a traitor on the police force, and so with Mishima being a possible liability to their plan with the increasing likelihood that he knows something that they don't want revealed, Tanimura announces that the two will be meeting before he leaves to the docks. In this latter section of the game, we will see more of the main protagonists meeting and interacting, as at the end of the game, they'll be mostly familiar with the roles they serve in the story and their goals, all aligning for the finale. But I'm getting ahead of myself. There were interactions of this nature between them, both subtle and obvious, earlier in the story, but it definitely is increased more during this section of the game. Aside from the interaction with Kiryu when playing as SAEJIMA and briefly seeing Tanimura as AKIYAMA, there were only ever mentions of other characters and seeing how the actions of another actively affected Kamurocho. For example, with Tanimura you come across police on duty, of whom mention that they're on some sort of special duty without mentioning much, but with the hindsight of playing as SAEJIMA, we know that they're on an extensive duty to find him. I really appreciate this sense of world building, as we get to see different perspectives of how the other characters affect the world around not only them but the others too. I also really like how the characters interact with one another, as aside from having a common goal of taking down their respective villains, they all interact as though they would be friends with one another in some way, which is something I truly do appreciate and found rather entertaining to see in the game. At the docks, Mishima mentions how Katsuragi is working with the police as he overheard such a thing on the phone, as well as the fact that he's being hunted down, confirming the notion that he was supposed to die alongside Ihara. A gunshot soon rings out, and from the shadows emerges Sugiyuchi. Tanimura then explains how he knew that Sugiyuchi was the traitor, ranging from sending his eye to Homeland, his overly expensive shoes and watch among many other things. Additionally, he also brings up the fact that Sugiyuchi worked alongside his father on the UNO cyber shooting, meaning that only one of them could have covered up what truly happened, and that was him. Suddenly, the room is brightened, and Sudo alongside an army of police officers burst into the room. Sudo is hesitant to give the order to shoot, knowing that he's forbidden from doing so, and thus, after a brief moment of gloating, Sugiyuchi is silenced by Tanimura, whose gunshot rings out into the room. He isn't afraid to shoot, mentioning how he was never one to play by the rules, and so a chase ensues, as the two jump into speedboats and take their chase into the sea. After damaging his boat and forcing him to take the chase to the docks once again, Sugiyuchi reveals that he was the one who killed Tanimura's father, and vows that he'll kill him next. With that, the two fight. After taking him down, Sugiyuchi reveals more, that he was never a cop, and that he was sworn brothers with Katsuragi and thus a member of the UNO cyber clan. We then cut back to what happened during that day after SAEJIMA left. All the men he killed are found to be alive before definitively being killed by Katsuragi when he reveals that the bullets SAEJIMA used weren't lethal. I'll come back to this in a moment, so for now, keep it in the back of your mind. Eventually, Sugiyuchi enters the room, in which the two briefly discuss their plan going forward before completing the staging of the incident, as Sugiyuchi shoots Katsuragi to make it look like SAEJIMA killed them all. We then cut to him filling a report and Seishiro Munakata, if whom isn't fooled by the false report, pointing out all of the discrepancies before ultimately asking Sugiyuchi to introduce him to Katsuragi, in which if he did so, then the report would be passed as written. And so, we cut back to the present day, where Sugiyuchi expresses his regret for having led the life he did, doing nothing but following orders from the police and Yakuza alike and losing sight of his own dream, talking about how he never had anyone to confide in as there, quite understandably, wouldn't have been anyone who understood his position. Though when trying to inquire into what Munakata is trying to accomplish, Sugiyuchi tries to discourage Tanimura from pursuing this any further, though to no avail. So he stands up, and before he can say anything, he's shot and killed by someone who speeds off in one of the boats the two had used to get there, and so with his final breaths being ones of relief, Sugiyuchi dies. We then cut to Sasai, who's at Homeland holding the residents hostage. He pulls out a gun, and a gunshot rings out. Overall, Tanimura's section of the game was amazing, as it's here that so much of the plot is revealed, a true rollercoaster in twists and turns in the story, something I enjoyed during my first playthrough of the game, Sugiyuchi, while not excusing all of the wrong that he did, makes his plight known as someone who lost sight of their own dream as the years piled on following orders from those around him, gradually growing to regret the path he chose as the years passed by, making his final words being ones of relief captivating to the player as the game presents a new side to his character which was left vague and subtle up until this moment of the game. I enjoyed Tanimura's gameplay a lot, much like the other characters. He's unique and mechanically as well as narratively interesting to play as the many things specific to him are introduced, such as the parry during combat, the spectacle of being able to play as a member of the police force in the game, a group that while present in the previous games, we only ever saw allied with the main characters such as Date and Kiryu and a multitude of other examples. I also really like how these 4 chapters continually expand upon Tanimura's character, initially presenting him as a crooked cop who takes advantage of illegalities around him, but as his section goes on, he grows more likable as we see his intelligence, his plight, and through all of that, his underlying desire to find the truth about his father and more importantly, deliver long-awaited justice to those who deserve it. So, with that, we conclude Tanimura's part of the game.
We watch as a washed-up Hamazaki slowly makes his way to the Morning Glory Orphanage, at first seen by Haruka before Kiryu arrives and sees him as well. Later that night, Kiryu and Hamazaki discuss the misconception that Hamazaki inadvertently created in SAEJIMA's mind in trying to tell him what really happened on the day of the incident in 1985. During their jailbreak, the two had been separated before he could tell the full story in its entirety. Knowing this, Hamazaki asks Kiryu to go to Kamurocho to deliver a message to SAEJIMA and prevent any physical confrontation. Keep in mind that Hamazaki isn't aware of any of the advancements in the story since the jailbreak occurred, so he's still under the impression that SAEJIMA is planning to get revenge on Majima. Of course, we know that the two have seemingly resolved that misconception, but Hamazaki doesn't know that. With that aside, Hamazaki shows Kiryu a record of Okinawa Penitentiary too, and all of the money that has been going in and out of the institution, in which when Kiryu sees it, he's shocked. In Yakuza 1, the Tojo clan was going to war with itself to attain the missing 10 billion yen. Jingu, though outside of the Tojo clan, was trying to attain that money for himself, in which it's revealed that the money was supposed to go to the penitentiary. The record shows that the ultimate goal was to destroy the Tojo clan, in which Hamazaki wants Kiryu to put a stop to that, as if he doesn't, then his and so many others' life's work will be destroyed. Listening in on the conversation is Haruka, in which we cut to the next morning where the rest of the children in the orphanage are introduced to Hamazaki, in which she disrupts and demands that he doesn't come any closer to them. Hamazaki understands and leaves, whereas Kiryu finds her on the beach, in which the two talk about her worries regarding him, and how she doesn't trust Hamazaki since the previous game. I really like how the game further shows the consequences of what happened in that game as opposed to forgetting all about it. The game furthers the notion that Hamazaki is approaching some sort of redemption for what he did, but that doesn't excuse it, as there are people who aren't willing to trust him as much as Kiryu is. Haruka is one of those people, terrified and arguably traumatized at having to watch Kiryu get stabbed and nearly lose him at the end of Yakuza 3, especially when the game could have just forgotten about Hamazaki and write him out of the story like they did with characters such as Sayama and many others, choosing to bring him back with the introduction of newer themes such as trust, redemption, and forgiveness to ultimately give a proper send-off that this game in particular makes the effort to earn him. Don't worry though, that send-off doesn't conclude with the happy ending you may think it does, but once again, I'm getting ahead of myself. At the police station, Kiryu and Hamazaki overhear Yasuko begging the police to check for Tiger SAEJIMA in their records, in which that garners their attention as they soon find themselves talking in a more private area. When informed that Tiger SAEJIMA is already in Kamurocho, Yasuko tries to leave, though the sirens are heard and what appears to be police have arrived. During their escape, they're cornered, and so we enter a long fight through the Tamashiro family office, of which has been dormant since the previous game. After the fight, Hamazaki tells Kiryu and Yasuko to go ahead of him, asking Kiryu to ensure that she gets to Kamurocho. When the two leave, his vision begins to fade. The gunshots from his jailbreak with SAEJIMA seem to have reopened as he falls to the ground. I really like this first chapter of this section in the game, as Kiryu is a pre-established character from all of the games we've seen him in, and for that reason, the game doesn't necessarily need to establish him in the way that it does for the other characters, of whom are ones we've seen for the first time in the series. For this reason, I believe that the game successfully uses this chapter to tie up loose ends left in the previous game, as while the ending that Yakuza 3 left on was good for that game respectively, the consequences of what happened during the ending of that game are ones that would need to be presented in this game. As mentioned, I really appreciate that the game makes an effort to redeem Hamazaki's character, not excusing what he did but showing that he's learnt to have faith in others and that he regrets attacking Kiryu in that game. Additionally, trying to make up for what he did only to a certain degree of success, as characters such as Haruka still refuse to trust him. We cut to Tanimura, of whom is paying his respects to Sugiyuchi and Sasai. Though both were traitors, they were ultimately individuals forced into following orders from those above them, and went out with the brand of justice to call their own. Sugiyuchi knew that telling Tanimura what happened during the day of the shooting would be signing his own death warrant, and Sasai took his own life to spare Tanimura, Zao, and Meihua, as to make Munakata think that all three of them were dead. March 13th, 2010, Kiryu and Yasuko arrive in Kamurocho, though something is wrong. The city is crawling with guards, in which the two of them walk into New Serena, in which Kiryu asks why Yasuko needed to see her brother so badly to the extent of where she would murder for it. It's here that he reaches the conclusion that they're not actually blood siblings, but more rather adoptive ones. When Yasuko was in need of a kidney transplant, Taiga wasn't a match, and so he tracked down Yasuko's biological father in hopes that he would donate his kidney. However, he demanded a large sum of money for it, in which SAEJIMA went to extreme efforts to ensure that he could get it before his Sai offered to give it to him under the condition that he joined his family. After the explanation, Kiryu asks Yasuko to sit in the bar and calm down, mentioning that her desire to see her brother has completely clouded her judgment. Kiryu intends to find SAEJIMA on his own and reunite the two. On his way to the Millennium Tower, Kiryu watches Majima be arrested, in which when he speaks to him, Majima tells Kiryu that Daigo is the one behind his arrest, and that Yasuko is in danger, and the 10 billion yen, the Saiwa clan incident in 1985, and herself are all interconnected in some form. In a meeting with Daigo Dojima, Nagata offers to get rid of the Saiwa clan in exchange for Arai's promotion into a high-ranking position within the clan. The Saiwa clan have already been trying to find some method to counter this, as we then cut to Purgatory as he's holding SAEJIMA hostage. He reveals that he was the one who killed the 18 people that day, and some insight into what he's planning. Katsuragi wants to break away from Nagata's control, in which in order to do so he wants the file that Hamazaki gave to Kiryu, money from Sky Finance's vault, as well as SAEJIMA and Yasuko. A man eventually revealing himself as Kiddo walks in, revealing his supposed allegiance with Katsuragi. Back with Kiryu, he finds Date passed out on the floor inside of New Sarana, coming to the conclusion that it's possible that he was drugged by Yasuko as she offered him a drink after he briefly took a moment to talk with Kiryu outside of the bar earlier in the game. After looking for Yasuko and following after her as she follows two strangely familiar individuals, we eventually cut to AKIYAMA and TANIMURA inside of the sewers, mistaking the person following them to be a member of the Saiwa clan. TANIMURA gives Yasuko his gun and tells her to use it when she needs to, and thus, while she runs ahead, Kiryu finds the two men waiting for him. Unknowing the fact that they have the same goals, they fight. After doing so, Kiryu looks for Yasuko. One detail I like in this game is that if you go back to the area you were fighting in, you can actually find TANIMURA and AKIYAMA standing and sitting there. I personally took a moment to laugh at them. Don't worry, I'll feel bad for AKIYAMA when this happens again in Yakuza 6. But with that aside, Kiryu, AKIYAMA and TANIMURA all find themselves in a rec room with the florist sitting within, explaining that Yasuko has already been taken by Katsuragi and Kiddo. I want to take this moment to talk about the thing everyone familiar with this game is already aware of, the Rubber Bullets plot twist that's been revealed at numerous points in the game, namely TANIMURA's part of the game. This reveals that SAEJIMA, despite being the one who initiated the attack, wasn't the one who actually did any killing that day. The guns that he and Majima attained the day prior were ones that were loaded with rubber bullets that the police were testing for non-lethal purposes such as riot control and whatnot. The entire day of the assassination was coordinated by Sugiyuchi and Katsuragi, and also covered up by the police force. In my opinion, I think it accomplishes what it set out to do. It would shock everyone on their first playthrough that there was a greater sense of depth and planning that went into the day of the hit, not just some mindless assassination that SAEJIMA and Majima were planning. To them, it was an act of honor for their respective bosses, but in the minds of those planning from the shadows, it was a meticulous plan that had gone accordingly. Though I do think that it is very disappointing to some extent. When the shock had died down, part of me felt as though the game was creating artificial shock by essentially placing a retcon on everything that had happened, seemingly for the purpose of keeping SAEJIMA's body count narratively squeaky clean. It also takes away from the previous scenes of the game that made rewatching them almost dramatically ironic, as we as the player know that SAEJIMA isn't actually killing anyone here. One could argue that the game's twist had been visually hinted at by the fact that there isn't actually any blood coming out of the wounds left by his bullets, which is a fair point. Additionally, SAEJIMA's speech doesn't mean much during a second playthrough, as though we're aware that he believes that he killed people, we also know that no one died by his hand that day. This leads me to something that I want to say about the writing of this game as a whole. It tries to do too much, but it is ultimately held down by the norms set by the previous games. Yakuza protagonists don't kill. Sorry, hang on. Narratively don't kill. But having SAEJIMA do so would break that norm, and I do feel as though the game realized that and tried to use this plot twist as a way to keep his body count at 0. Again, narratively. In my opinion, I think that this game's writing tries to create stakes and elevate itself into something that this series hasn't seen before, but ultimately didn't have the balls to go out and see any of it through. And that harms the game in more ways than it benefits it. There are so many missed opportunities that come with this reveal, such as exploring SAEJIMA's remorse as a character and possibly trying to redeem him while not excusing what he did. Much like Hamazaki, I like SAEJIMA's character, I don't want that to be misunderstood, but so much of the guilt and remorse he feels goes unexplored as the game tries to swiftly move on to the next part of the game before it can truly deeply dive into his psyche, in which I think is a shame, because instead we get a plot reveal which allows the game to get away with not doing so. AKIYAMA, Kiryu and TANIMURA are discussing with Date about the money that was stolen from AKIYAMA, which culminated to about 100 billion yen. Suspecting that it was Kiddo who found it, we cut to 9 days earlier where Kiddo entered the office in search of AKIYAMA, which tinkering with the bookshelf within the office led to him discovering a vault filled with money. Seeing Hana arriving to the office, he scrambles to close the vault and reorganize the bookshelf so that they wouldn't know that he discovered the vault. We then cut back to the present moment, where AKIYAMA expresses his gratitude for Kiryu, as the Millennium Tower explosion during the events of Yakuza 1 had saved
saved his life. But with that aside, Kiryu calls Katsuragi through Tanimura's phone in hopes of making a deal, returning the SAEJIMA siblings back as well as AKIYAMA's money in exchange for the file that Hamazaki had given to him. It's here that I want to talk about the grinding of this game, as in preparation for the long battle ahead, there is a lot that needs to be done, such as buying healing items and gaining experience. In this game, every time you level up, you're rewarded with orbs which you can then invest into whatever part of the progression system that you want. I really liked this, and I think it's one of the best iterations of the progression system we've seen yet in the game so far, as statistical upgrades such as health are given automatically each time you level up, giving you the opportunity to invest in whatever part of the system you'd like. It places more of an emphasis on grinding than the previous game, but not enough to the extent in Yakuza Kiwami where I felt as though I had to take constant pauses in the story to grind. I think that this game strikes a nice balance, and for that I commend it a lot. With that aside, I do want to talk about the next long fight, as notably throughout the game you don't play as Kiryu as much as you play with the other characters, but this long fight more than makes up for that, as it's a slugfest through the entire UN Osaiwa clan, since it's filled with fun and challenging gameplay that I really enjoyed my time with. I remember this section of the game being quite difficult during my first playthrough of the game, but having a greater understanding and familiarity with it has led me to enjoy it a lot, both the gameplay and the spectacle of fighting through an entire clan. This isn't the first time we've fought through Kamurocho Hills, and it certainly isn't the last, in which I really enjoy watching the evolution of this area throughout its construction and by extension the consistent evolution of Kamurocho. After the fight, Kiryu makes his way to the roof where negotiations occur. Kiddo arrives with the money and gives Yasuko back in exchange for the file, though he pulls out his gun, seemingly about to shoot Kiryu before turning the gun to face Katsuragi, shooting him multiple times. Arai is eventually revealed to have been watching the negotiations, and just when he compliments Kiddo, a gunshot rings out, as Kiddo falls to the ground and descends with the money. Kiryu vows to ensure that the Tojo doesn't end up in the hands of Arai, in which all he has to say is that he's too late. He always is, that's why crisis is always upon the clan. With that, when untying SAEJIMA, he immediately runs to Katsuragi and reveals that he was wearing a bulletproof vest when he was shot by Kiddo, in which after contemplating momentarily, SAEJIMA decides that he isn't worth killing. With his back turned, Katsuragi shoots his arm, in which when he's about to shoot again, the second bullet hits Yasuko. Momentarily dazed, she walks over to the shocked Katsuragi, pulling out the gun that Tanimura gave to her and promising that it will be the gun that avenges his father's death. She turns to her brother and apologizes for all she did, mentioning that she has to be the one who does this as she already has so much blood on her hands. Shooting and killing Katsuragi, she falls to the ground, dying in the arms of her brother she loved so dearly, Tiger SAEJIMA. We watch as Munakata scolds Arai for not retrieving the money, which is now in the hands of Kiryu and his associates. Eventually, he orders him to use whatever means necessary to get it, giving pictures of the children at the Morning Glory Orphanage and a gun, which is turned on him. Arai reveals that he's an officer of the law, and that there is a code to uphold, and attacking innocent children disgraces it tenfold. He shoots, seemingly killing Munakata. Back with the Yakuza 4, SAEJIMA and AKIYAMA are seemingly mourning the loss of Yasuko, whereas Tanimura is restless at the fact that Munakata remains on the police force. Eventually, Haruka calls Kiryu and informs him of Hamazaki's death, expressing her regrets for her mistrust in him and not being able to apologize and tell him that she was wrong in assuming he was malicious. He also asked her to pass on a message, to not let the police grasp the Tojo, as it's the only proof left of the legacy left behind by Kiryu, SAEJIMA, himself, and so many others. Informing SAEJIMA of this message, Kiryu reflects upon his own realizations and how he believes that there are people who depend on them for their dreams being fulfilled, and thus they need to put an end to the antics of Munakata and his many associates. AKIYAMA and Tanimura arrive, and together, the Yakuza 4 sit within New Sarona and plan their attack, to draw out whoever they can with the money in their possession and take them all down simultaneously. So, after declaring their union, we're given the chance to freely roam Kamurocho as all 4 protagonists and ensure that everything is prepared for the many battles ahead. I personally spent this time as Kiryu in the Colosseum, not the most optimal form of grinding, as if you lose at any point during a tournament, you don't gain anything at all, but a few examples of the many things you can do for experience are sub-stories and drinking at bars. Additionally, destroying items during combat also gives you a good amount of XP as well. This is a game which tells a story about the past and how it affects the future, and the importance of preserving and honouring a legacy of one's predecessors. For example, though the game does place a spotlight on the other characters such as Kiryu, SAEJIMA, and AKIYAMA, I do believe that a core emphasis is placed on Tanimura, as his section is a prime example of the many themes of this game. Legacy, as shown through his plight regarding his deceased father and wanting to find the truth of what happened to him. Even when he completed that objective, he wanted to continue onward and bring Munakata down in hopes of preserving that legacy and honouring honoring him with the same code of justice adopted previously by his father and now himself. Additionally, people like AKIYAMA and SAEJIMA and their stories are examples of how the past affects the future, namely, the ending of Yakuza 1 having such a direct impact on AKIYAMA's life, and how SAEJIMA went through a roller coaster of what he thought was betrayal and eventually loss as a direct result of the Saiwa attack he conducted, which additionally led Yasuko to walk down a path of murder and bloodshed, all for a chance to see him again. As for Kiryu, while he assumes a lesser role in the game, it is still one worth mentioning, as I personally believe that he represents the legacy of the Tojo clan, alongside SAEJIMA, but the game doesn't place much emphasis on that, and how preserving it is important for the life's work that went into it by not only himself but those who came before him. Daigo, while initially showing his will to maintain his code of honor regardless of the financial status of the clan, as shown by his unwillingness to sacrifice Kiryu's land at the beginning of Yakuza 3 which led him to getting shot, ultimately the possibility of financial downfall got to his head as he gradually grew more and more willing to sacrifice the Tojo clan's legacy in hopes of being able to attain financial benefit with Munakata. Kiryu was here to set him back on the path he left him on during the events of Yakuza 2, blaming himself for having left him to his own devices, with no guidance which he assumes led Daigo to walk down the path he's embarking on here. I especially appreciate this game's writing, though flawed at times, the presentation of its core themes are somewhat subtle throughout most of the game until moments such as the finale. With that, after briefly mourning Yasuko collectively, the Yakuza 4 march down the streets of Kamurocho. Glaring at the same roof, they'll be ending everyone's antics. Briefly discussing, they walk towards the entrance. Later that night, we watch as the flies all gather at the center of the web. Munakata, Arai, Daigo, and Kido, all of whom have their own ambitions and goals. Things gradually begin to escalate between them before a helicopter arrives, and as the mountain of money scatters and flies into the air, it lands. From within, one by one, emerges the Yakuza 4, all of whom have a fight to pick and an ass to kick. So, with no time to waste, we begin with the first fight, playing as AKIYAMA as he fights against Arai. Next, we go balls out as SAEJIMA as he fights against Kido. After that, we fight Daigo as Kiryu before the true finale of this game, that being as TANIMURA as he goes against Munakata and an entire army of men atop the Millennium Tower. The spectacle of finally facing the corruption within the police force single-handedly, and the spectacle of this fight was truly something to behold, and I enjoyed it quite a bit. I really like how this fight is reminiscent of Jingu's fight in Yakuza 1, as the man himself doesn't actually do any damage but instead sends his men to fight. When you take all of them down, he simply does nothing but run away from you continually. In hindsight though, as much as I really enjoyed this fight and think it ends the finale amazingly, I do think that for me personally, most of this fight was cheesing through it. Since there are so many enemies attacking you at once and so little means for crowd control, the most I could do is use the invincibility frames granted with grabbing someone and attacking all of them through those means specifically. Of course, there were the occasional moments where I used a heat action or I was able to actually land an attack combo, but for the most part, grabbing them was my main form of attack. With that though, after finishing the fight, we cut to the Yakuza 4 standing triumphantly over them. Munakata laughs at them, gloating that their efforts will have been for nothing as he will remain on the force. AKIYAMA makes a phone call which leads to Date and Sudo on a helicopter, raining down a newspaper exposing the police force's corruption, in which Munakata tries to shoot AKIYAMA, but the money he had in his breast pocket stopped the bullet from hitting him. Eventually, Munakata realizes that his plans have failed and a gunshot rings out. 2 weeks later, 30th of March in 2010, is when we find out that Munakata had shot himself that day, seemingly as he realized how pointless it would have been to try and salvage what was left of his failed plan. Hana visits AKIYAMA asking for her old job back, and Kiryu and Date are talking atop the roof of New Sarana. Date is returning to the police force, in which TANIMURA is awaiting him below, and thus the two depart until next time, cutting to the credits. After the sequence, we then cut to Kiryu, SAEJIMA, Majima, and Daigo meeting at the Tojo clan headquarters as they commemorate the SAEJIMA family's inauguration, thus ending Yakuza 4. After beating the game, there are a lot of things that you can do. For example, enter into premium adventure mode and wander the streets of Kamurocho doing as you please, doing sub-stories and additional grinding for the Amon clan if you do all of them. I didn't do all of them for this specific playthrough of the game, but I have done them before and they were quite enjoyable. Furthermore, you can also play through legend mode, which is an extra challenge for those looking for one, as if you die at any point during as such, you need to restart from your last save point rather than being able to retry from a specific section. It places more emphasis on playing the game well, eliminating all possibilities that could result in death, and it is one that I appreciate even if once again I didn't do it for this specific playthrough. With that though, I do want to conclude things.
Yakuza 4 overall is an amazing game that takes this series to heights we've never seen until this point, with 4 playable protagonists, all with their own captivating gameplay and story interconnecting to one another in some form. While the writing is flawed at some points, I do think that the game is overall well written and I enjoyed this story a lot, being able to see the world of Yakuza through many different perspectives as this game culminates into a wonderful experience. So, there's the video. I hope you all enjoyed it. First video of 2020-24. I hope you all like it, and I apologize for the delay as this was meant to be uploaded before the new year. I also want to thank you all for the support on the Yakuza 3 video. Right now it's at 1,000 views, which my brain hasn't even had the time to fully digest that number. I really appreciate it, and I hope that my future videos don't disappoint. If you want to view the list of games I want to make videos about in the future, then you can always do so through the link in the description, as well as any afterthoughts or messages I may want to add. With that, I haven't really got much else I want to say, so I'll see you all in my next video. I hope you all enjoyed the video, and I wish you all a very pleasant evening.